Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the America's Future Series Space Innovation Summit, Fireside Chat, Modernizing Space Architectures for Combating Cyber Threats and Secure Resilient Space Capabilities with our very special guest, General Keith Alexander. First, I want to sincerely thank General Alexander for making the time to join us for this discussion today. General Alexander is a retired four-star Army general who previously served as the highest ranked military official for U.S. Cybercom and NSA CSS, where he led these DoD agencies during the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq in a time when attempted cyber attacks against the US government were really on the rise. General Alexander was not only the leader, but he was the first commander of US Cybercom when it was stood up back in 2010. Today, General Alexander has transitioned his military expertise to the commercial sector as founder and co-CEO of IronNet Cybersecurity. Thank you again, General, for being with us today.
Well, thanks, Craig. An honor to be here. And the reason I stood up IronNet was so that I would have a job, and I knew I couldn't work for somebody else. So it's an honor to be here. Thanks.
Really appreciate you taking your time today. I know you're extremely busy, and thanks again. I think this is going to be a very exciting discussion, and we're looking forward to the discussion. Excuse me. The first thing I want to do to sort of set the stage today is sort of think about how, as DoD is looking at modernizing space communication systems, what are you seeing in the current threat landscape, and are there common threats across the landscape, or are they a series of individual threats we should be concerned about?
Yeah, so let me just take it in the three areas that I see threats, starting with Ukraine and Russia and what's going on in the Ukraine-Russia war. As you know, on 24 February, when this all started, everybody anticipated that Russia would come in and race through Ukraine and have all the Ukraine under their control in 72 hours. Russia didn't prepare logistics, didn't have the trained forces, and didn't have a plan. They just thought Ukraine would collapse. They didn't. Mike Tyson punched them in the nose as they crossed it. And as you can now see, Russia has had to limit their claim to victory to eastern Ukraine, where they have been making progress. One of the things that came out early on, as you know, from the Viasat time, probably one of the more publicized things, was an attack on Viasat that hit early on the 24th of February. It had a lot of exposure and probably not as much impact as was put into the press, as you know, from the Viasat, because your company acted really quickly, got things back up and running, fixed the terminals, and within a week or two, you were pretty much back to normal, and you could continue to operate in that season. Having said that, Russia and Ukraine are going to continue to duke it out in eastern Ukraine. What I am concerned about is that continues to morph and Russia shifts to a more global European US view. We anticipate there will be more attacks against the US and Europe in cyber. No one knows where Putin is going to take this, but I expect that we'll see more attacks. We've seen a bunch of attacks into the Ukraine infrastructure, but I expect that will grow against us. And we are seeing parts of that as the ransomware or the hacker groups in Russia, like Conti and Emotet and others, are continuing to attack us. I think that's going to grow. What causes me great concern as well is what's going on with China. If you think about China, and a week before the attack, Putin and Xi Jinping met in China. I'm sure Putin told Xi Jinping, look, we're going to go in there. It shouldn't last more than 72 hours. We're going to do this because China left their 5,000 or 6,000 people from China in Ukraine, never gave them a heads up to get out. So they thought this would also be an easy win. It wasn't. And it's interesting because as that was going on, as the attacks occurred, China hit Taiwan with a number of social media hits saying, you're next. And then that went away when Russia faltered. What China did do is they went after the South China Sea islands. They militarized those in the March timeframe, and they continued to advance. Most concerning, Russia called their operation support to military operations, not an act of war. They say Ukraine was part of Russia. China did the same thing, saying that support to military operations using their military is not an act of war if it's to quell an uprising within their land, specifically thinking about Taiwan. And then a few days later, they said that the Straits of Taiwan were Chinese territorial waters. And the consequence of that is China is now putting in position the same thing that Russia did going after Ukraine. They're doing that after Taiwan. I bring that up because Russia is concerning. China is going to be an order of magnitude more difficult for the United States and the world, and actually for the space community. We race against China in this area. China has far more cyber capabilities. They are stealing our intellectual property, and they're going to continue to grow. This is a huge issue for not only the United States, but for the rest of the world. If China goes into Taiwan, we expect that you're going to see a lot of, I think, a flurry of activity. What do you do on sanctions against China? Holding the sanctions against Russia was a lot easier than it will be against China. That's something that Europe and the United States are going to have to figure their way through. And I am concerned about that. The last part I just hit quickly is Iran. While we're watching Russia and China, Iran is continuing to attack with destructive malware and others into the Middle East, the Gulf states and others. Those leak out and will come after us as they did in 2012 against the financial sector. So we've got to be prepared for all that. Bottom line, Craig, I think it is as dangerous as it has ever been for our country in cyber, and it's growing, and especially for the space community for a whole host of reasons.
I think that's really fascinating, and I think about those sort of three different elements you talked about. The logistics failure of Russia has been, for me, one of the most fascinating elements of this, and it sort of makes me think I would hate to fight a war against Amazon because they'd probably be really good at getting everything right where it needs to be. But it does make you understand that there's probably some lessons to be learned at what commercial companies can do and how we translate that to military capabilities. And the other thing you mentioned is how intertwined the world economy is and how difficult it would be to create sanctions against China, and how important basically the economy is for both countries that depend on each other. And you mentioned China's constant threat of IP and the danger that presents to our global leadership, both militarily and commercially. In that context, what do you think are some of the biggest concerns about cyber and the space industrial base specifically?
Well, so there's two sets of concerns I'd look at for space. First, I am really impressed with how our commercial sector, all these space companies, have jumped on this to put commercial applications in space. So it's no longer the government lead, and it's actually the commercial sector. And there are a number of companies that we deal with that are actually in that sector. So they're racing down that road. First problem, theft of intellectual property. You think about what we're going on in this race in space. It's a huge race with a lot of opportunities for putting people on the moon, for taking the next step, building the International Space Station, all these things. There's a ton of intellectual property that our companies have. China is going to steal that. They're doing it from the defense industrial base. They're going to do it here. They'll build it cheaper and they'll outpace us in that area. So that's the first thing. The second part, and perhaps more concerning, is as these races go on and we start to deploy people into space, impacting those space operations with cyber attacks, I think we're going to see more and more of that. And that's of concern. And the question that I think everybody should ask, is that an act of war? How do you do that? And of course, the folks that are doing it, let's say that you're competing against China to get someplace first. There's been concern that they have attacked in the past to disrupt space operations. And of course, they'd say that wasn't us, it was a hacker. So it would be hard to pin it on them without divulging a lot of information. I think we're going to see those two, theft of intellectual property and impacting space operations. So we have to protect both.
Yeah, but as a follow-up for that, because those are sort of two very interesting concerns that are related but separate. So on the first hand, what can space companies do to protect their intellectual property in the cyber domain? And how do we protect ourselves against the threat of theft of IP?
So a great question. And one that when we work with the defense industrial base and others, I would say it's very similar for space companies, for energy, for finance, and the defense industrial base, other critical infrastructure. And the answer is no company can do it themselves. If you think one company can hire all the best people in their cyber center, and especially small companies that are, laser focused, so to speak, on getting something done in space, they aren't putting a lot of resources into the cyber operations and security. They're going to do some. So the flip side of that is if that's the way it works from a capitalistic perspective, then what we have to do is we have to have multiple companies work together and share those resources at network speed. Think of it as a collective defense approach, which the director for national cyber, Chris Inglis, said, to beat one of us, you got to beat all of us. We've got to take that approach in space. So create a collective defense capability in space, have people work together, and expand their visibility to the defense industrial base and other critical infrastructure so they're all working together. I think that's the most important thing we can do for space. Build that collective dome, if you will, and then help make sure that these companies, their intellectual property is protected and their operations are protected.
And do you think that I agree that the sharing of threat intelligence at basically machine time so that it's relevant is crucial to protecting ourselves? Do you think that architecture and infrastructure for doing that, is that a function of the government, or is that a function of industry coming together and agreeing on a way to share it, or is it something in between?
It's in between, it's both. So when you think about it, the space community can't fire back. The energy sector can't fire back. That's an inherently government responsibility. When I was in government, I was asked, well, why can't we attack back? I'll give you a great case in point. Let's say that North Korea is attacking Sony in cyber. And Sony says, well, they're attacking us, so I'm going to attack them back and wipe out their communications and stop this. What Sony doesn't realize is that when they do that attack, North Korea would see that as an act of war and perhaps fire on South Korea with artillery and start a conflict. So that's an inherently government responsibility. So the second part is it's often misunderstood who the real attacker is. If you think it's this guy over here, you think it's coming out of Russia and it's actually coming out of China and you attack Russia. Oops, wrong thing. So for those two reasons, the government needs to do it. But the government can't see it. So when you're being attacked, how does the government see it? That's what Sony had happen. Sony didn't know they were being attacked until it was all over. So now you're left with, okay, let's go back and look at this. What happened and how do we fix that? And the answer is you need the ability to detect and share events at network speed as they're occurring. And those are events that may be unknown unknowns as well as known knowns, but you have to share those events amongst players within the community and between the commercial side or the private side and the government. So public-private partnership says, show me a radar picture of who's attacking you. The government can take that on. This is one of the most important things that the space community can and must do. If you're not being protected like that, then you're at risk for not just the theft of intellectual property, but potentially interrupting space operations at key points. So you've got to do both. And I think that's a key part of getting this forward.
You mentioned one thing that was really fascinating to me, and then this is also in relation to your earlier point about impacting space operations. You described a hypothetical scenario where an adversary attacked a Western entity, Sony in this case, and if hypothetically Sony was to attack back, that the adversary might escalate into another domain. I think right now there's a sense, especially in the West and in the liberal democracies of the West, that cyber attacks, when they're perpetrated against us, we sort of shrug our shoulders and say, yeah, this happens. And our adversaries are very willing to launch cyber attacks against us, whereas we're far more reticent to launch cyber attacks against them. Should there be a doctrine among the US government, or should there be a sort of agreed upon policy among commercial and industrial and government things that considers cyber attacks escalatory and even authorizes a proportional response in the cyber domain or in other domains to create a level of deterrence against cyber attacks?
Yeah, so the administration, both current and previous, has said that they will respond to cyber attacks with any element of national power, including cyber. So that already exists.
Excellent.
More importantly, though, just to update you on a couple things, while you see these attacks going on, U.S. Cyber Command has been giving the authority to defend forward against those who would be attacking us. So those defend forward capabilities would be blocking and stopping those kind of actions. And that's exactly what you want. You want to be able to shoot down the Archer. You don't want to let that hit. And then it's like letting a missile hit Boulder and then saying, okay, we know where that came from. We'll go hit them. Boulder saying, well, couldn't we have stopped that missile? Now in cyber, we need to stop those missiles. And the only way we can do it is by sharing that information at speed.
Yep.
And giving the government the authority to go after those who are attacking under their rules of engagement, which I believe they now have with that defend forward capability.
Excellent. There's a fascinating topic here. We could go all day probably on this one, but I do want to shift gears a little and talk about the sort of forward-looking networking capabilities in space. And what do you see as the key secure networking technologies and capabilities that will help the U.S. maintain a secure communications advantage in space?
That's a great question. Well, Viasat, of course, because you're here, right? Viasat.
Well, thank you. We humbly appreciate that.
I think it's not just encryption, but it's protection of your encryption systems. And you know that based on the experience of the Ukraine war. What do you have to do to help protect all those who are leveraging satellites and other communication system as well? So I think from our perspective, putting that together, thinking about how this whole network works as one. So it's space and terrestrial capabilities that are all linked together to make your space communications work. And it's that ecosystem that you now have to step back and say, okay, I have to make sure it's encrypted. I have to defend it. I have to make sure it's resilient so that if one site goes down for whatever reason, I can still communicate with space assets, especially at critical times. I think those are the things that we need to think about when we're talking about communication systems in the future. It's got to be encrypted so that the adversary doesn't know which part you're in that sensitive mission in order to disrupt you at just the time that's opportune for them. I think that when I look at that, I think that's key. The second part would be, as you probably can answer this question better than I, when you start thinking about the satellite systems that we have up there, how do we leverage those as part of that ecosystem that kind of takes your terrestrial layer, connects you from the ground to the terrestrial layer, and from the terrestrial layer out to the platforms that are operating in space. So you're going to need to do both. And I'm sure that's an area that you and Viasat and others have tremendous experience in it.
Yeah, I think you bring out two key capabilities that are really important. And the first is you made the distinction between information assurance, encryption, and cybersecurity, protecting the system at the whole. And so you have to protect the data, the IA piece of it, but for the data to get where it needs to go, you also have to protect the network and the communication system. And understanding that those are both key components to security, but different components is really important. And I think the second thing you bring up, this idea of optionality, where you have multiple paths in the terrestrial layer and perhaps multiple paths in the space layer and multiple ways in the terrestrial and space layer to interact to give you resilience, that in fact creates deterrence too, because the adversary has to know which paths you could be using. And if you do the IA right, they don't know which paths you are using because the data is all hidden and obscured. And that gets you back to the point you mentioned earlier, is to beat any of us, you have to beat all of us. And so if you create a system with lots of optionality, it's very difficult for an adversary to disrupt that, because you have to basically bring everything down to shut the whole system down. And that to me is the core of a resilient system that has optionality and really good IA and really good cybersecurity. And as you think about creating that optionality, how do you see the commercial sector as a partner to create and enable a highly secure, resilient space ecosystem that you're describing?
So there's two parts to this, just to add to what we were just talking about. The second part that the commercial sector has to do is have the ability to detect attacks on their systems and share that with the government who can respond to it. So today, the adversary gets an infinite number of shots. You have to block an infinite number to be successful. If you block an infinite number -1, I know that's infinity, you probably can't do that, but you get the gist. If you just take one, it only takes one of those to get through to make it a bad day. So rather than giving them an infinite number of shots at you, what you really want to do is have the government now intervene and stop them so they don't get that infinite, stop them at 3 tries or whatever, limit their ability to do that. I think that's got to be key to what we're talking about here. I think of that as a radar view in space. So think about now, you can see behind you, if you were to take all those connections and put all that together and say, here's where they're attacking, the government can see it, the commercial sector can see it. And what the commercial sector would be doing is, just as you highlighted, we might be changing communications paths to ensure the resilience there is for space operations. I have 15 different ways of getting this to the space vehicle and or the space station or whatever operation I want. They can knock down 4 of those and I'm still good to go. And they don't know which one I'm really using. I think that's important now. A mesh network for space is highly important. I think the other part where the commercial sector is coming in is like Viasat, having a number of satellite capabilities up there makes it very difficult for them to block communications. So what you do and what other companies are doing in this area is hugely important for, I think, for the future of space and our space-based operations.
Yeah, I think one of the things in a sort of resilient network or a resilient mesh network is proliferation is helpful. Having more assets in space is helpful. But if those proliferated assets are basically one network, that network may have a cyber vulnerability, and you can reach in to a proliferated network and bring down the whole network because it's the same network with the same network management. It's really important to have different networks, different orbital regimes, different frequencies. And again, back to optionality, where you have lots of different choices that have different capabilities, but different attack vectors and different vulnerabilities. And you have to create that optionality and that resistance to it by not having the same thing. Even if you have a single proliferated system, it's still very vulnerable. And that there's a sort of interesting parallel that you can draw when we talk about networking and networks in the terrestrial sense, especially social networks. There's a sort of axiom out there called Metcalf's law, which describes the utility of a network as being proportional to the square of the number of its users. So the more users you have, a network exponentially becomes more useful. There's sort of a dark side to that in this context when we talk about mesh networks and hybrid networks here, where the more networks you bring together and the more users that are on them, you exponentially increase the attack surface of those networks too, because now suddenly you've got more ways into the network just because you have a more widely reaching network. And when you think about that, again, in the context of the government and the commercial capabilities partnering together to create a resilient network, how do you ensure the cybersecurity of those capabilities without affecting the agility of commercial companies that can bring? Is there a trade that can be made there, or can that trade be avoided?
Well, I think, interestingly, this is where cloud capabilities, not the clouds in space, but the actual clouds like AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google, et cetera. When you take those cloud infrastructure and you say, I need now to do a huge understanding of all the issues that are hitting my space-based platforms, you need to have some way of expanding and contracting your compute space to show the visibility of that. And I think that's best done in the cloud, anonymously. And what you want to do is share those attacks that are going on with the government as they occur. So if you were to think about this as just a picture of all these assets, what you'd really want to do is see which ones are being hit with these types of attacks. The government can see those. These are X types of attack. These are probes, these are attacks, these are recon. Here's what's going on. Share that with the government so that they can go after the source. That's the first thing. I do think you bring up a good point on the commercial side. More and more of our space-based capabilities are going to be commercial. You're seeing that with everything that Elon Musk is doing, where Amazon's going, where you are, and where others are going. So you look at companies like C.L.A.S. and others that are putting satellites in space. This is a huge opportunity. And now, as you just noted, We have to work together for the collective defense. I think that's the only way you can do it.
Very good. This sort of brings up another point about how quickly the industry is blossoming, and there are so many more companies doing things in space now. Obviously, the big ones that you mentioned were very active in space, but there's a host of very small companies that are doing things in space just because of the democratization of space that's happening, with much easier access to launch and much easier access to small satellites that can bring big capabilities. What advice would you give to emerging or even established companies as they try to balance innovative capabilities development with protecting their adversaries against cyber threats in space?
Or protecting their companies from adversaries, right?
Yes.
Because we definitely want to protect the adversaries. So, we do deal with a number of small companies like Intuitive Machines, X-Energy, C.L.A.S., and others in creating that collective infrastructure. And I think part of the reason is when you look at it, tremendous technology and expertise in accomplishing a space mission. And what they're saying is, look, I'm really good at doing this. I can put a man on the moon. I can go do this. I can make all these things happen, but we're not a security company. And so what we're doing is you need to blend those two together, have everybody work together. Now start building that ecosystem and saying, as Chris Inglis had said, to beat one of us, you got to beat all of us. Now let's put the partnership together, share threat information at speed, and share it with the government. That approach, I think, will ensure the best protection. And what it will also do is allow the government to see who's attacking us, where and when. And the government can now take and ratchet that up as appropriate. I believe, this is an exciting time for us as a country, because what you and other companies are doing in space is great. But it's also clear that in accomplishing those operations in those space missions, you have to have the protection of the government and potentially stopping other nations from attacking you at critical parts. So that means we've got to work together. There's no other way. And I think you can see companies going to that conclusion. And I think this next year and a half will be exciting for us in that. And we have a lot to do to get to that collective defense posture.
Yeah, I think there's some really fascinating implications of the intersection of technology and policy and collaboration. And so it's clear that sharing threat intelligence is going to be the key to an adequate cyber defense for ourselves and our commercial partners and our allies. And creating that infrastructure to share that is going to be key. And I think that's a really interesting challenge that reaches across the entire industry and the government. And it's going to be exciting to see if we can make progress in that area. And I know Viasat has done some work with DHS CISA in the Enhanced Cybersecurity Services Program for Critical Infrastructure. And I know IronNet has done some really interesting work in that area as well. And I look forward to our organizations partnering, and I look forward to the broader community partnering to be able to provide that kind of sharing of knowledge, because that's going to be the key. As we wind down here on time, General, thank you again for being here. I'll leave you the floor. Any last comments or anything you'd like to say to the audience as we move on to the next one of these?
Yeah, so thanks, Craig. First, thanks for hosting and being magnanimous and allowing me to talk on some of these things. I am passionate about cybersecurity. I'm also passionate about space. What all of you as companies are doing to help push us further into space, it's amazing. I always wanted to be an astronaut, so someday I might get to go up. I'm trying to work that in. Now, having said that, it's also critical for the future of your companies and all of you working together that the government and the private sector work together. So I think we have to build that collective defense opportunity, and we need to do it quickly because many of you are already pressing forward with missions into space. This is critical for the future of our nation, for your company, because what you do in space reflects upon the United States. And I think it's amazing what you're going to do. And we want to make sure that you're protected in accomplishing those missions, both your intellectual property and your operations. So thanks for what you're doing. An honor and privilege to work with you. And thanks, Craig, for hosting this for me.
General, thank you very much. It was my pleasure. This was a fascinating and enlightening discussion. I look forward to talking to you again. Thank you once again. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Greg.